There's $300 billion sitting in Western banks that Jeffrey Sachs, the Harvard economist who helped rebuild Eastern Europe after the Cold War, says was stolen. Not borrowed, not frozen, stolen. What makes this explosive is that Sachs isn't some fringe commentator. This is the man who advised 3 UN Secretary Generals, who designed the economic reforms that transformed Poland, who sat at the table when the Soviet Union collapsed, and now he's saying the United States has committed what he calls the largest financial theft in modern history. What should make you pause is something deeper. This isn't just about Russia. According to Sachs, this $300 billion represents something far more dangerous. The moment the US dollar stopped being money and became a weapon.
The United States has weaponized the dollar, which is so reckless. $300 billion reportedly. We did the same with several other governments. Well, after a while, people don't want to use the dollar if somehow the United States government doesn't like the way you're dealing. So there will be a de-dollarization over time for sure. This is already happening very fast, by the way.
And if he's right, your country's reserves could be next. Let me break down what actually happened here, because the numbers are staggering, and where the money actually sits might surprise you. In March 2022, following Russia's military action in Ukraine, Western governments froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. What most people don't realize, despite all the talk about US theft, America only holds about $5 billion of these assets. The real story is in Europe. 183 billion euros, that's $192 billion, sits in a single Belgian institution called Euroclear. Another 19 billion euros is in France, 30 billion euros in Japan, 25 billion pounds in the UK. The overwhelming majority, about 75% of the total, is held in European financial institutions, not American ones. Now, freezing assets during conflicts isn't unprecedented. But according to Sachs, this is the moment we crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The US and its allies didn't just freeze these assets, they're now talking about seizing them permanently, taking them, using them to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. Sachs argues this violates fundamental principles of international law. Digging into the legal analysis reveals something fascinating. It's far more complex than it seems. There's this concept called collective countermeasures. Basically, can third-party countries like Belgium or France seize assets on behalf of Ukraine, the actual victim? Most international law specialists say no. They argue that without a binding international court decision requiring Russia to pay reparations, this constitutes unlawful expropriation. The legal community is deeply split. You have scholars like Harold Coe arguing it's legitimate under the doctrine of state responsibility for wrongful acts. The majority of international law experts warn it sets a dangerous precedent for sovereign immunity. And this is exactly the scenario Sachs has been warning about for over a decade. In closed-door conversations with US officials, he urged caution. He warned, "This is madness. It will destroy global trust in the dollar." In private meetings, he's been saying, "Stop doing this. This is crazy." It will destroy trust in the dollar. And now, watching the global response, he's saying, "I told you so," in the most consequential way possible. To understand why Sachs is calling this theft, you need to understand how international finance actually works. And this is where it gets fascinating. When countries hold reserves in dollars or euros, they're essentially lending money to the United States or Europe. It's a trust system that's worked since World War II because everyone believed these countries would honor their obligations, regardless of politics. Central banks around the world park their money in US Treasury bonds and European government bonds because they were considered the safest assets on Earth. Sachs came to a sobering realization. The US was systematically turning this trust into a weapon. First with Iran's reserves, then Venezuela's, then North Korea's, then Afghanistan's. Each time, the justification was different, but the pattern was identical. Political disagreement led to financial seizure. The data from recent studies shows that Sachs wasn't exaggerating about the scale. The U.S. has frozen or seized assets from countries representing billions of people. When you add up Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Afghanistan, and now Russia, you're talking about actions affecting over half the world's population. Here's where Sachs's analysis gets really interesting. He argues that what we're witnessing isn't just sanctions. It's the transformation of the dollar from a medium of exchange into what he calls an instrument of aggressive policy. Think about it this way. If you're the central bank of any country that doesn't perfectly align with U.S. foreign policy, what does this tell you? It tells you that your reserves aren't really yours. They're yours as long as Washington approves of your government's actions. Now, let's look at the legal framework, because this is where Sachs's background becomes crucial. As someone who helped design post-Soviet economic systems, he understands international law from both theoretical and practical perspectives. Academic research supports his core argument. Legal scholars have concluded that many of these sanctions violate principles of public international law, including UN Charter obligations and WTO principles of non-discrimination. The freezing of state assets without proper legal process challenges fundamental concepts of sovereign immunity that have underpinned international law since the Treaty of Westphalia. The research takes an eye-opening turn. The European Central Bank has issued explicit warnings about what this could do to the euro's status as a reserve currency. Think about it. If you're China or Saudi Arabia, major holders of European debt, and you see sovereign assets being seized for political reasons, what do? You start looking for alternatives. The data shows this isn't just theoretical. China and Russia now settle 95% of their trade in rubles and yuan. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent 35.2% of world economic output, compared to just 29.3% for the G7. These aren't marginal shifts. We're watching the construction of parallel financial systems in real time. And as these systems evolve, the political dynamics behind them reveal a striking contradiction. The United States, which holds the smallest share of these assets, is pushing hardest for outright confiscation. They even passed something called the Repo Act in April 2024, giving the president authority to seize Russian assets. Meanwhile, Europe, which holds the vast majority and would bear the brunt of any retaliation, is much more cautious. They're trying to find middle ground, using only the profits generated by these assets, about 3 to 4 billion euros annually, rather than touching the principal. What's unfolding goes far beyond what most people realize. We're not just witnessing a dispute over Russian assets. We're watching the birth of a completely new financial system. But here's something that makes Sachs's perspective even more compelling and controversial. He's been documenting Russian theft for decades, just of a different kind. In the 1990s, when he was helping design Russia's transition from communism, he witnessed what he called spontaneous privatizations of Russia's vast natural resources. He estimated that tens of billions of dollars worth of oil, gas, and mineral assets were plundered by insiders and well-placed officials. Sachs wrote about an epidemic of corruption that allowed oligarchs to grab state assets worth half the world market value. He detailed how cheap loans from Russia's central bank were converted to dollars and stashed abroad, only to be repaid in worthless rubles. This wasn't gradual wealth transfer. This was systematic looting. So when Sachs calls the Western asset seizure theft, he's someone who's documented actual theft on a massive scale. The irony is profound. The economist who exposed Russia's internal corruption is now accusing the West of the same behavior. When Sachs addressed finance ministers from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS countries, in October 2024, he laid out something that should make every economist pay attention. He said, You can't use the dollar as a payments mechanism when a president can unilaterally sign orders to seize billions in assets. Think about that for a moment. The dollar's power comes from everyone agreeing to use it. But what happens when using it becomes a liability rather than an advantage? The twist? Sachs himself has become a polarizing figure. Critics now call him a Kremlin mouthpiece, questioning whether his analysis is driven by genuine economic concerns or something else entirely. Yet his warnings about dollar weaponization keep proving prescient. That reversal is staggering. This is the same economist who, in his own writings, documented what he called the vast corruption in Russia's oil and gas sector, describing tens of billions of dollars being siphoned into private pockets during the Soviet collapse. Now, he's defending Russia's right to keep $300 billion in Western banks. Meanwhile, the economic pressure on Russia is intensifying. Their national welfare fund is projected to be depleted by 2026, with oil and gas revenues dropping to just $108 billion this year, down from a projected $142 billion. The frozen assets aren't just symbolic. They represent real financial pressure that's working. Sachs argues we're seeing the same pattern that destroyed the British pound's dominance after World War II, just accelerated. The difference is that this time, there are alternatives ready to step in. The BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative isn't just a proposal anymore, it's operational. Countries can now trade with each other without touching the dollar system at all. Sachs offers a surprising view. This is a defensive, not aggressive, response. He quotes BRICS countries as saying, "Why are we using US banks if they're just going to take our money away?" From their perspective, they're not trying to destroy the dollar. They're trying to protect themselves from having their money seized. The deeper pattern here is about trust and power. For 75 years, the US has benefited enormously from what economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow almost limitlessly because everyone needs dollars. But that privilege depends on trust. And Sachs argues that trust is evaporating. What this exposes is something fundamental about how power actually works in the 21st century. Military power still matters, but financial power can be even more decisive. The ability to freeze a country's assets, cut them off from payment systems, or destroy their currency. These are weapons of war that don't require firing a single shot. The fascinating thing is that Sachs has been on both sides of this equation. In the 1990s, he was part of the system that created Russia's integration with Western finance. Now he's watching that same system being weaponized against Russia. And he's saying, this is exactly what I warned would happen. What we're really seeing here is a fundamental question about the future of international finance. The $300 billion represents something unprecedented, the largest sovereign asset seizure in modern history. But the deeper question is, what happens to the global financial system when the majority of the world's population doesn't support the actions of the countries controlling that system? This connects to something much larger than most people realize. The research shows that decisions about these assets involve a stark trade-off: immediate financial support for Ukraine versus retaining leverage for future peace negotiations. The World Bank estimates Ukraine's reconstruction will cost nearly $500 billion. But once you spend the assets, you lose the bargaining chip. There's also the retaliation risk. Russia has already seized approximately $50 billion in Western assets over the past 3 years. If the West confiscates the $300 billion, Russia could target significant European corporate assets still in the country, creating an escalating cycle of economic warfare. Which makes me wonder, if we're moving toward a world where economic assets become weapons of war, where sovereign immunity disappears when geopolitical interests conflict, what does that mean for global stability? Are we witnessing the birth of a multipolar financial system or the breakdown of the international order itself? Because according to Jeffrey Sachs, the economist who helped build the post-Cold War system, we're watching that system destroy itself, one frozen asset at a time. And if Sachs is right, that $300 billion wasn't just seized, It might be the price of a global financial reckoning. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Capital Compass, so you won't miss any future deep dives into the forces shaping our world. See you in the next video.